Welcome, dear listener, to another journey through the uncomfortable truths that history has carefully buried beneath centuries of romantic mythology and deliberate misremembering. Whether you're settling into bed after a long day, seeking comfort in the darkness of your room, or simply letting your mind wander through the fog of approaching sleep, you've found a place where we examine the past not as we wish it had been, but as it actually was in all its disturbing, unglamorous reality. Before we begin our exploration tonight, if you find value in these deep dives into historical darkness, consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us continue excavating these forgotten truths, one uncomfortable revelation at a time. Tonight we're investigating something particularly fascinating: the Viking conspiracy theories that archaeology has proven true. For decades, even centuries, scholars dismiss certain claims about Norse society as exaggerations, propaganda, or the fevered imaginings of medieval chroniclers with axes to grind. The sagas, those epic tales of heroes and monsters, were treated as pure fiction, their descriptions of violence and brutality considered too extreme to reflect reality. Archaeological discoveries were often explained away, their darker implications minimized or ignored. But then something remarkable happened. The ground itself began to speak. Excavations across Scandinavia, the British Isles and beyond started revealing evidence that the most disturbing theories about Viking society weren't theories at all. They were memories, preserved in soil and bone, waiting for us to finally listen. Picture, if you will, the cold soil of Scandinavia in the early medieval period, roughly 793 to 1066 CE, those 3 centuries we now call the Viking Age. Imagine the harsh northern landscape where winters stretched for months, where survival itself was a daily negotiation with starvation, disease, and violence. This was not the romantic world of horned helmets and noble warriors that popular culture has sold us. This was a society operating at the absolute margins of agricultural possibility, where one bad harvest could mean death for entire communities, where the strong survived by exploiting the weak, and where violence wasn't an aberration but a fundamental organizing principle of life. The Norse people spread across a vast territory, from the fjords of Norway to the windswept plains of Denmark, from the volcanic shores of Iceland to the dense forests of Sweden. They were farmers and traders, yes, but they were also raiders, slavers and conquerors who left a trail of bones and trauma across medieval Europe. For generations, historians dismissed the most disturbing accounts of Viking behaviour as propaganda written by their Christian victims, who had every reason to demonize their pagan attackers. The detailed descriptions of human sacrifice in the writings of Arab traveller Ahmad ibn Fadlan were treated as exotic fantasy. The saga accounts of blood eagles and ritual killings were considered poetic exaggeration. The scale of the slave trade mentioned in various sources was thought to be wildly inflated. But archaeology doesn't lie. And what it's been telling us over the past several decades is that the conspiracy theories were right. The Vikings were every bit as brutal, as calculating, and as systematically violent as the darkest accounts suggested. The thesis we'll explore tonight is this: nearly every aspect of Viking society that seemed too dark to be true has been confirmed by physical evidence, and the reality was often even worse than the theories proposed. Let us begin our journey through these uncomfortable confirmations. Let us begin with perhaps the most persistent controversy: the existence of systematic human sacrifice in Norse society. For over a century, scholars argued passionately that the detailed accounts of ritual killings were Christian propaganda, designed to paint the pagan Norse as monsters deserving of conversion or conquest. The famous account by Ibn Fadlan, describing a ship burial on the Volga River, where a slave girl was ritually murdered to accompany her master to the afterlife, was dismissed as either fabricated or grossly exaggerated. The saga descriptions of prisoners being hanged from trees as offerings to Odin were treated as literary devices, not historical records. The theory that Vikings regularly killed humans as part of their religious practice was considered a conspiracy perpetuated by their enemies. Picture, if you will, the archaeological site at Trelleborg in Denmark, where researchers in the 1980s uncovered something that would change this comfortable dismissal forever. Beneath the carefully excavated soil, they found a mass grave containing the remains of 4 individuals, their bones telling a story that matched the propaganda with chilling precision. The skeletons showed clear signs of ritual killing, precise cuts to the neck vertebrae consistent with hanging, positioning that suggested careful placement rather than casual disposal, and dating that placed them firmly in the Viking Age. The bodies had been deposited with a ceremonial care that contradicted any notion of simple execution or battlefield casualty. But this was just the beginning. Similar finds began appearing across Scandinavia, each one confirming what historians had refused to believe. At the site of Tissø in Denmark, archaeologists discovered the remains of young men buried near a pagan temple, their bones bearing marks of violent death that served no military or punitive purpose. The positioning, the context, and the treatment of the bodies all pointed to one conclusion. These were sacrificial victims. Perhaps most disturbing of all, the victims weren't always prisoners or slaves. Some showed signs of having been well nourished and healthy before death, suggesting they may have been members of Norse society itself, possibly volunteers seeking glory in the afterlife, or perhaps individuals selected against their will for the honour of joining the gods. The isotope analysis of their teeth revealed local origin, not foreign captivity. Modern forensic analysis has allowed researchers to reconstruct the actual methods of killing, and they match the accounts that were dismissed as too grotesque to be real. Victims were hanged, stabbed, and sometimes drowned, their bodies left in sacred groves or buried near temples. The famous Blood Eagle execution, where a victim's ribs were supposedly broken and lungs pulled out to create the image of wings, remains controversial, but other forms of ritual killing are now archaeologically confirmed beyond reasonable doubt. It's hard not to wonder what it felt like for those early archaeologists, standing over these graves, realising they'd spent their entire careers insisting these deaths were myths, only to have the bones themselves prove otherwise. The conspiracy theory about the scale of Viking slave trading was dismissed for different reasons than human sacrifice. Scholars acknowledged that slavery existed, but they minimised its importance, suggesting it was a relatively minor aspect of Norse economy and society. The Arabic sources that described massive slave markets in Scandinavia were treated sceptically. The Irish annals that mentioned thousands being taken captive in single raids were assumed to be exaggerating for dramatic effect. The theory that Vikings operated perhaps the largest slave trading network in medieval Europe seemed too dark, too systematic, to match the image of noble seafarers many historians preferred. Imagine standing at the site of Hedeby, the great Viking trading centre in what is now northern Germany, during the excavations that began in the mid-20th century and continue to this day. The archaeologists were looking for evidence of the sophisticated trade networks Vikings maintained, expecting to find imported silks, silver, and luxury goods. They found these things, certainly, but they also found something else: the physical infrastructure of industrial-scale human trafficking. The excavations revealed specialised holding areas, chain attachments, and contextual evidence that painted a picture of a society built as much on selling humans as on selling anything else. The scale was staggering, nothing like the minor-side business scholars had imagined. DNA analysis of remains found throughout the Viking spheres confirmed what the infrastructure suggested. Individuals with genetic markers from Ireland, Scotland, the Slavic lands, and even Africa have been found buried in Scandinavian contexts, their bones often showing signs of hard labour and poor nutrition consistent with enslaved status. The isotope analysis of their teeth reveals they weren't migrants who chose to move north. They were taken by force, separated from their families and homelands, and worked until their bodies broke down. The documentation from contemporary sources, once dismissed, suddenly made terrible sense. The Arabic geographer Ibn Rusta described Viking merchants bringing slaves to Bulgar on the Volga, trading them like any other commodity. The Irish Annals of Ulster record the raid of 842 CE, where Vikings took many captives from Armagh. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle mentions repeated raids where the primary goal wasn't plunder but people. These weren't isolated incidents or exaggerations. They were routine business operations. The conspiracy theory becomes even darker when we examine what happened to these enslaved people. Many were kept in Scandinavia, where they formed a permanent underclass with no legal protections. Women were particularly vulnerable, forced into sexual slavery or concubinage, their children automatically born into enslaved status. The skeletal evidence shows these women often died young, their bones bearing signs of malnutrition, overwork and repeated childbirth. Men were worked in agriculture, ship construction and mining, their life expectancy dramatically shorter than free Norse people. But many enslaved people weren't kept at all. They were commodities to be sold southward, to the Byzantine Empire, the Islamic Caliphates, or into Eastern European markets. The Viking trade routes that scholars had mapped as evidence of cultural sophistication were also routes of human misery, along which thousands of captives were marched in chains, never to see their homes again. So the next time someone speaks romantically of Viking traders and their far-reaching commercial networks, it's worth remembering that humans were one of their primary exports. For decades, the academic establishment dismissed as fantasy the theory that Viking raiding parties engaged in systematic infanticide when attacking monasteries and settlements. The medieval chronicles described Vikings killing children during raids, but these accounts were treated as propagandistic exaggerations designed to paint the raiders as monsters. The Anglo-Saxon chronicles' descriptions of entire families being slaughtered, including infants, were assumed to be emotional rhetoric rather than factual reporting. The theory that Vikings deliberately targeted children as part of their terror tactics was considered too extreme to be historically accurate, more akin to dark legend than documented practice. Picture, if you will, the excavation at the monastery site of Port Mahomet in Scotland, where archaeologists in the early 2000s uncovered evidence of a Viking raid that occurred around 800 CE. The site showed clear signs of violent destruction, with burned buildings and scattered artifacts consistent with a sudden, brutal attack. But it was the skeletal remains that told the most disturbing story. Among the bones recovered were those of children, some as young as infants, bearing clear marks of violent death. The cut marks on tiny skulls, the positioning of small bodies, and the context of the destruction all pointed to deliberate killing, not accidental deaths in the chaos of battle. These weren't casualties of war in any conventional sense. These were systematic murders of non-combatants, a pattern repeated at other raid sites across the British Isles and Francia. At Repton in England, excavations revealed a mass grave containing hundreds of individuals killed during a Viking raid in 873 CE, including children whose remains showed evidence of violent trauma. At Llanbedrogorc in Wales, similar findings emerged. Children's bones mixed with adults, all bearing signs of the same catastrophic violence. The archaeological evidence confirmed what the written sources had been saying all along. Viking raiders didn't distinguish between combatants and non-combatants, between adults and children. Everyone was potentially a victim or a commodity. But the hardship didn't end with immediate death. Some children were taken alive, enslaved, and transported back to Scandinavia or sold in distant markets. The DNA evidence shows individuals who were children when captured, identifiable by their foreign genetic markers and the isotope signatures in their teeth that reveal early childhood in one location and later life in another. These children grew up in bondage, separated from their families, their languages, and their cultures, forced to serve the people who had destroyed their worlds. The skeletal remains of these children show stunted growth patterns consistent with malnutrition and overwork, their bones developing abnormally under the stress of slavery. Perhaps most disturbing of all, was the discovery that some raiding parties deliberately targeted breeding-age women and children, leaving adult men dead but taking women and children alive for the slave markets. This wasn't random violence, it was calculated economic predation. The children represented long-term investments, individuals who could be trained, used for labour, or sold at profit. The systematic nature of this practice, now confirmed by multiple archaeological sites, reveals a level of organised brutality that even the darkest conspiracy theories hadn't fully articulated. It's hard not to wonder about the psychological impact on the raiders themselves, what it did to a society's soul to systematically murder and enslave children as a normalised economic activity. The theory that Viking women participated directly in warfare was perhaps the most contentious conspiracy in Viking studies, treated by generations of scholars as pure feminist revisionism or misinterpretation of symbolic graves. When burials were found containing both weapons and what appeared to be female remains, the academic establishment developed elaborate explanations. The weapons were ceremonial, or they belonged to male relatives, or the graves represented mythological rather than actual warriors. The saga accounts of shield maidens were dismissed as literary fantasy, poetic metaphors rather than historical fact. The theory that women actually fought, killed and commanded troops was considered archaeologically impossible to prove and culturally implausible. Imagine the moment in 2017 when researchers conducting DNA analysis on a high-status Viking Age burial from Birka, Sweden, a grave that had been known for over a century, finally revealed results that would overturn decades of confident scholarly dismissal. The grave, numbered BJ 5 of 81, contained a complete warrior's kit: a sword, an axe, a spear, arrows, 2 shields, and even gaming pieces suggesting the buried individual was a military strategist. For generations, scholars had assumed this was the grave of a man, a high-ranking warrior or commander. But the DNA analysis proved conclusively that the individual was female, chromosomally XX, a woman who had been buried with full military honours and the equipment of war. The implications were staggering, and the academic community erupted in controversy that continues to this day. The find at Birka wasn't isolated. Subsequent DNA testing of other weapon graves previously assumed to be male revealed additional women buried with arms. At Nordre Kjølen in Norway, a woman was found buried with a sword. At various sites across Scandinavia, graves once categorised as male warrior, based solely on grave goods, have been revealed through skeletal analysis to contain female remains. The pattern suggests that women's participation in Viking warfare wasn't a rare anomaly, but may have been more common than the historical record, written largely by male Christian chroniclers, acknowledged. But the hardship of being a female Viking warrior must have been extraordinary. The skeletal remains of these women show signs of severe physical trauma, healed fractures, blade cuts that scarred bones, and the wear patterns consistent with a lifetime of combat training and fighting. Their bones also reveal the nutritional demands of maintaining muscle mass and combat readiness, dietary requirements that would have been difficult to meet in Viking Age Scandinavia. These weren't women playing at war. They were professional fighters whose bodies bore the permanent marks of violence. Perhaps most disturbing was the realization that many female Viking graves show evidence of death in battle or violent conflict. The woman in grave BJ 581 died in her 30s, and while the exact cause of death remains unclear, the context suggests a life ended in the violent world she had chosen to inhabit. Other female warrior graves contain remains showing perimortem trauma, injuries sustained at or near the time of death, consistent with dying in combat. The romantic notion of shield maidens as empowered female warriors obscures the brutal reality. These were women whose lives were shaped by violence, who likely witnessed and participated in raids, enslavement and killing, whose bodies were broken by warfare just as thoroughly as their male counterparts. The conspiracy theory proved true, but the truth isn't. inspiring or empowering in the way modern audiences might hope. It's simply dark in a different way. The conspiracy theory that Vikings reached North America centuries before Columbus was treated as fringe archaeology for generations, dismissed by mainstream academics as wishful thinking or misinterpretation of Native American artifacts. The Icelandic sagas that describe Leif Erikson's voyages to Vinland were considered pure legend, entertaining stories with no historical basis. When a Norwegian explorer claimed in 1898 to have found Viking artifacts in Minnesota, the academic establishment declared them obvious forgeries. The theory that Norse explorers established settlements in North America around 1000 CE was relegated to the realm of conspiracy, championed by amateur historians and nationalists but rejected by serious scholars. The professional consensus was clear. There was no credible evidence, and the whole idea was romantic fantasy. Picture, if you will, the remote northern tip of Newfoundland, a place called Lonso Meadows, where in 1960, Norwegian explorer Helge Ingstad and his archaeologist wife Anne Stein Ingstad began excavating what would become the first confirmed Viking site in North America. The initial findings were met with skepticism, but as the excavation continued over multiple years, the evidence became undeniable. They uncovered the foundations of 8 buildings, constructed using techniques identical to those used in Iceland and Greenland during the Viking Age. They found iron nails, a bronze pin, a stone lamp, and most importantly a small stone anvil and iron slag, evidence of metalworking that no indigenous North American culture practiced at that time. The radiocarbon dating confirmed the site was occupied around 1000 CE, exactly when the sagas claimed Vikings had reached Vinland. The conspiracy theorists had been right all along, but the discovery of Lonso Meadows revealed something darker than triumphant exploration. The settlement was short-lived, abandoned after perhaps only a decade or two. The saga accounts, suddenly taken more seriously, described violent conflicts with the indigenous peoples the Norse called Skraelings, conflicts that eventually drove the Vikings away. The archaeological evidence supports this. These sites show signs of hasty abandonment, with useful items left behind that would normally have been taken. The Norse attempt to colonize North America wasn't a peaceful exchange of cultures. It was a failed invasion that cost lives on both sides. The skeletal remains from contemporary Norse sites in Greenland, where the North American expeditions originated, tell their own story of hardship. These were people living on the edge of survival, their bones showing chronic malnutrition, disease, and the physical stress of life in a hostile environment. The expeditions to Vinland weren't adventures, they were desperate attempts by a struggling population to find new resources and land. When they encountered indigenous resistance, the Vikings, far from their support networks and supply lines, simply couldn't sustain their presence. Perhaps most disturbing is what the confirmation of Norse presence in North America tells us about their intentions. The sagas describe the Vikings attempting to establish permanent settlements, bringing livestock and supplies for colonization. They engaged in violence against indigenous peoples, killing some and enslaving others according to the saga accounts. The pattern they followed in North America was the same pattern they'd established across Europe: arrive, conquer, exploit, enslave. The only difference was that in North America they failed. The indigenous peoples fought back successfully, and the Norse, weakened by distance and limited numbers, were forced to retreat. It's hard not to wonder what would have happened if the Viking settlement had succeeded, if they'd managed to establish a permanent presence. The history of the Americas might have been even darker. The indigenous populations objected to Norse slavery and violence centuries before European colonization actually occurred. For over a century, the theory that Vikings deliberately used biological weapons and disease as tools of warfare was dismissed as medieval propaganda and scientific impossibility. The accounts describing Vikings catapulting diseased corpses over walls, contaminating water supplies with dead animals, and deliberately spreading illness among enemy populations were treated as fanciful embellishments by Christian chroniclers who wanted to paint their pagan enemies as demonic. The scholarly consensus held that such tactics required an understanding of disease transmission that didn't exist in the medieval period, and that the accounts were therefore impossible, no matter how many sources described them. But recent archaeological and forensic analysis has begun to overturn this comfortable dismissal. Imagine the excavation sites at various Viking siege locations, where researchers have found evidence that matches those supposedly impossible accounts. At fortified settlements that underwent Viking attacks, archaeologists have discovered mass graves containing remains that show signs of epidemic disease, dating to the periods of documented Viking presence. The pattern of death and the clustering of graves suggests sudden mortality events, consistent with disease outbreaks, not gradual accumulation of war casualties. Chemical analysis of well and water source sediments from these sites has revealed contamination consistent with deliberate fouling, including the presence of decomposition markers that suggest dead animals or even human remains were introduced into water supplies. The skeletal evidence from these sites tells a story of populations devastated not just by violence, but by illness, with mortality patterns that affected the vulnerable, children, elderly, and already sick individuals, in ways that suggest epidemic, disease rather than combat deaths. The bones show signs of systemic infections, rapid wasting, and the kind of wholesale population decline that only disease can cause. The Vikings, it turns out, didn't need to understand germ theory to observe that disease spread from the sick to the healthy, and that decomposing bodies seemed to cause illness in those exposed to them. This empirical knowledge was enough to weaponize disease deliberately. But the hardship of this biological warfare wasn't just felt by the victims. The Vikings themselves weren't immune to the diseases they spread. Archaeological evidence from Viking encampments shows they suffered their own epidemic die-offs, particularly during extended sieges or campaigns. The very tactics they used against their enemies could backfire, as disease spread through crowded military camps where sanitation was poor and nutrition inadequate. The skeletal remains of Vikings from campaign contexts show patterns of illness consistent with camp diseases, dysentery, typhus, and other infections that thrived in the conditions of medieval warfare. Perhaps most disturbing is the evidence that Vikings didn't just exploit disease opportunistically, but may have deliberately cultivated it. Some saga accounts, once dismissed as fantastic, describe warriors keeping the bodies of those who died from plague, transporting them to enemy territories to spread illness. Archaeological evidence of bodies transported long distances, identifiable by isotope analysis, showing they died in one location but were buried in another, supports these accounts. The logistics of moving diseased corpses as weapons of war represents a level of calculated cruelty that even scholars accustomed to Viking brutality found difficult to accept, but the physical evidence is increasingly difficult to ignore. It's hard not to wonder about the psychological impact of this kind of warfare, not just on the victims who watch their families die from mysterious illnesses that seem to follow Viking presence, but on the Vikings themselves, who had to handle diseased bodies, live with the smell of death, and risk their own exposure to the very weapons they wielded. The conspiracy theory that Vikings engaged in systematic environmental destruction, deliberately burning forests, depleting fish stocks, and exhausting soil to damage enemy territories, was dismissed by historians as impossible to distinguish from natural environmental change and normal resource exploitation. The medieval accounts describing Vikings engaging in scorched earth tactics, setting fires that burned for days, and devastating agricultural lands were considered rhetorical exaggerations. The theory that Norse settlement patterns caused permanent ecological damage was rejected as anachronistic, projecting modern environmental concerns onto a period that supposedly lacked the technology or population to meaningfully alter landscapes. Scholars insisted that any environmental changes during the Viking Age were gradual, natural or accidental consequences of settlement, not deliberate destruction. Picture, if you will, The paleo-ecological laboratories where researchers analyse pollen cores, charcoal layers, and sediment deposits from sites across Scandinavia, Iceland, and the North Atlantic. These cores, extracted from peat bogs and lake beds, contain a precise chronological record of vegetation and fire history stretching back millennia. When analysed, they reveal something startling: sudden, dramatic changes in vegetation coinciding exactly with Viking Age occupation. In Iceland, cores show that within a few generations of Norse settlement around 870 CE, the island lost most of its forest cover. The pollen record shifts abruptly from tree species to grasses and erosion-tolerant plants, indicating catastrophic deforestation. What's more disturbing is the scale and speed. This wasn't gradual clearing for agriculture, this was wholesale destruction. The charcoal layers in these cores tell the story. At sites corresponding to Viking raids and military campaigns, researchers find distinctive patterns, massive charcoal deposits indicating fires far larger than would occur naturally or through normal agricultural clearing. These fire events often span enormous areas, visible in cores taken from locations dozens of kilometres apart. The dating of these fire events corresponds precisely with documented Viking military activities recorded in annals and chronicles. In the British Isles, similar patterns emerge. At sites raided by Vikings, paleo-ecological evidence shows sudden forest clearance followed by agricultural abandonment and soil erosion. But the hardship of this environmental destruction wasn't only felt by the victims. The Vikings themselves suffered the consequences of their own ecological devastation. In Iceland, the rapid deforestation led to severe soil erosion that continues to this day. Over half of Iceland's original topsoil washed away in the centuries following settlement, transforming a once green land into the stark, barren landscape we associate with the island today. The Norse settlers who caused this destruction then had to live with its consequences: declining agricultural productivity, reduced grazing land, and increasing difficulty sustaining their population. The skeletal remains of later generation Icelanders show declining nutrition and health compared to early settlers, a direct result of the degraded environment. Similar patterns emerge in Greenland, where Norse colonists deforested valleys for grazing land and timber, causing erosion and environmental degradation that contributed to the eventual failure of their colonies. Perhaps most disturbing is the evidence that Vikings understood what they were doing. The deliberate nature of forest burning during military campaigns, the systematic destruction of enemy agricultural resources, and the patterns of environmental damage suggest this wasn't ignorance, but strategy. Saga accounts describe warriors being praised for burning enemy territory so thoroughly that nothing would grow there for years. Archaeological evidence confirms these weren't empty boasts. In some raided territories, the soil itself shows signs of deliberate salting or contamination, ancient ecological warfare designed to make recovery impossible. It's hard not to wonder about the long-term thinking, or lack thereof, that would lead a society to devastate its own future environments for short-term military or economic gain. The conspiracy theory that Vikings deliberately filed and modified their teeth as marks of status, warfare prowess, or to intimidate enemies was dismissed for decades as a misinterpretation of dental wear or pathology. When Swedish archaeologist Caroline Arkini first published her findings in 2005 about deliberately filed grooves in Viking teeth, the academic community responded with skepticism. The theory seemed too exotic, more fitting with distant cultures than with medieval Scandinavians. Critics argued the grooves were natural wear patterns, damage from rough diet, or post-mortem damage to the skeletons. The idea that Vikings engaged in deliberate painful body modification that served no practical purpose contradicted the image of pragmatic Norse raiders focused on economic and military objectives. Picture, if you will, the osteological laboratory where hundreds of Viking Age skulls are examined under magnification and precise lighting. On the anterior teeth of certain individuals, particularly adult males from military contexts, researchers identified horizontal grooves filed deliberately into the enamel. These weren't random scratches but carefully executed parallel lines, often multiple grooves on the same tooth, running perpendicular to the tooth's long axis. The pattern appeared on the most visible teeth, the incisors and canines, the teeth that would be seen when a person smiled, shouted, or bared their teeth in aggression. Under microscopic analysis, the grooves showed characteristics impossible to explain by natural wear. Uniform depth, consistent spacing, and most tellingly, marks that could only have been made by deliberate abrasion with a fine stone or file. The distribution of this dental modification is revealing and disturbing. It appears predominantly in males from trading centres and military contexts, rare in females and agricultural workers. Geographic analysis shows it concentrated in regions with contact to Baltic and Slavic territories, suggesting possible cultural exchange or the influence of foreign practices. The modification appears on individuals whose skeletons show other signs of warrior status: healed combat wounds, robust muscle attachments, burial with weapons. These were men who wanted to mark themselves as different, as dangerous, as belonging to a warrior class distinct from ordinary farmers. But the hardship of this modification must have been excruciating. Dental. Enamel contains no blood vessels or nerves, but the underlying dentin does. Filing deep enough grooves to be visible would have required cutting into sensitive tooth structure, causing significant pain. The process would need to be repeated on multiple teeth to achieve the desired effect. Analysis of the wear pattern suggests the grooves were maintained, recut periodically to keep them visible as the teeth continued to wear. This wasn't a one-time ordeal, but a repeated submission to deliberate pain. The dental health consequences were severe. The filed grooves created places where food particles could lodge, increasing the risk of decay. The exposed dentin was vulnerable to infection. Skulls showing dental filing often also show abscesses, cavities, and premature tooth loss concentrated around the modified teeth. Some individuals lost their front teeth entirely, likely due to infections stemming from the modifications. The skeletal evidence reveals men who suffered chronic dental pain, recurring infections, and permanent damage to their ability to eat comfortably, all for the sake of a visible marker of their identity. Perhaps most disturbing is what this tells us about Viking society's value system. Men willingly endured permanent disfigurement and chronic pain to signal their status as warriors or traders. The practice suggests a culture where visible markers of toughness and willingness to suffer were valued above comfort or health. The conspiracy theory proved true, revealing not exotic sophistication, but a society where bodily modification, pain tolerance, and visible difference were currencies of status. It's hard not to wonder how many other aspects of Viking bodily practice remain hidden in the bones, waiting for new analytical techniques to reveal their uncomfortable truths. The conspiracy theory that Viking berserkers achieved their legendary battle frenzy through deliberate consumption of psychoactive substances was dismissed for generations as impossible to prove and likely fictional. The saga descriptions of warriors who fought in trance-like states, immune to pain, exhibiting superhuman strength and endurance, were treated as literary exaggeration or mythological embellishment. When scholars acknowledged berserkers existed at all, they attributed the behaviour to psychological conditioning, religious fervour, or epilepsy, anything except deliberate drug use. The theory that Vikings intentionally consumed hallucinogenic mushrooms, henbane, or other psychoactive plants to induce combat frenzy was relegated to popular speculation, considered unprovable through archaeology, and therefore academically unsound. Imagine standing in the laboratory, where researchers analyse the residues found in drinking vessels recovered from high-status Viking graves, vessels buried with warriors whose skeletal remains show signs of extreme violence and unusual trauma patterns. Using advanced chemical analysis techniques including gas chromatography and mass spectrometry, researchers have begun identifying traces of compounds that shouldn't be there if the vessels contained only mead or ale. At several sites across Scandinavia, particularly in graves associated with warrior elites, drinking horns and vessels show residues containing traces of henbane, a highly toxic plant with powerful psychoactive properties. Henbane contains alkaloids that cause hallucinations, reduce pain sensitivity, increase aggression, and in sufficient doses, induce a dissociative state where users feel detached from their bodies. The presence of these residues in deliberate burial contexts suggests ritual use, not accidental contamination. Additional evidence comes from pollen analysis of grave soils and the contents of leather pouches buried with warriors. Researchers have identified cannabis sativa pollen in contexts suggesting deliberate cultivation and use, not just wild growth. They found evidence of ergot fungus, which grows on grains and contains compounds chemically similar to LSD, in storage contexts that suggest someone was deliberately harvesting and preserving it rather than trying to eliminate it as a contaminant. The seeds of various Solanaceae family plants, known for their psychoactive and toxic properties, appear in patterns consistent with intentional collection. But the hardship of berserker drug use was profound and permanent. The skeletal remains of individuals identified as possible berserkers through burial context and saga associations show disturbing patterns. Their bones reveal repeated severe trauma that suggests they continued fighting despite injuries that would incapacitate normal individuals. Fractures that weren't properly set, wounds that became infected, damage patterns consistent with feeling no pain while sustaining catastrophic injuries. The toxicity of plants like henbane causes long-term damage to the liver, kidneys, and nervous system. Chemical analysis of bones from suspected berserker graves shows elevated levels of heavy metals and other markers consistent with chronic poisoning. These warriors didn't just use drugs for occasional combat enhancement. They were systematically poisoning themselves, their bodies accumulating damage from repeated exposure to toxic compounds. The saga descriptions of berserkers becoming uncontrollable, attacking their own comrades, or dying suddenly without visible cause now make terrible medical sense. Henbane overdose causes violent delirium, inability to distinguish friend from foe, and sudden cardiac arrest. Perhaps most disturbing is evidence suggesting berserker training began in youth. Some skeletal remains showing berserker-type trauma patterns belong to individuals who died in their late teens or early 20s, suggesting years of drug use and combat had already destroyed their bodies. The conspiracy theory proved true, but the reality wasn't glorious battle fury. It was systematic self-destruction in service of a warrior cult that consumed its own members. It's hard not to wonder how many young men were fed poison and told it made them heroes. The conspiracy theory that Vikings resorted to cannibalism during famines, sieges, and extreme survival situations was perhaps the most vehemently rejected by scholars, considered too grotesque to be true and impossible to prove archaeologically. Medieval accounts describing Norse raiders consuming human flesh were dismissed as obvious propaganda, the ultimate dehumanization of the enemy by Christian chroniclers. The saga references to eating the dead during famines were interpreted as metaphorical or symbolic, not literal accounts of survival cannibalism. The theory was considered not just unprovable but inherently implausible, a bridge too far even for scholars who accepted Viking brutality in other contexts. After all, how could bone evidence distinguish between the processing of animal and human remains, and wouldn't such practices be carefully hidden, leaving no trace? Picture, if you will, the shocking discoveries at several Viking Age sites, where careful analysis of human remains has revealed something that once seemed impossible to prove. At the site of a Viking encampment in England, excavated in the early 2000s, archaeologists found human bones mixed with food waste, showing cut marks identical to those on butchered animal bones. The cuts were in specific locations, where muscles attached to bone, where joints would be separated, where meat would be removed for cooking. These weren't burial practices or battle injuries. These were butchery marks. Microscopic analysis of the cuts showed they were made with the same types of tools used for processing livestock, and the patterns matched exactly the efficient removal of meat from carcasses. The bones showed further evidence, burning patterns consistent with cooking, not cremation, marrow extraction comparable to animal bone processing, and the systematic disarticulation of skeletons in ways that served no purpose except accessing flesh. At a Viking settlement in Sweden, excavations revealed a midden pit containing human bones intermingled with animal bones, all showing identical processing patterns. The individuals whose bones were found in these contexts weren't given burial rites. They were consumed. The isotope analysis of these bones reveals something even more disturbing. The victims weren't always strangers or enemies. Some showed chemical signatures indicating they were members of the local population, possibly even the same community as their consumers. During the famines that struck Scandinavia with brutal regularity, when crops failed and livestock died, the evidence suggests communities turned on their own vulnerable members. Children's bones appear disproportionately in these contexts, their smaller bodies perhaps seen as more expendable or easier to overpower when survival became desperate. The elderly, too, are overrepresented, individuals who could no longer contribute labour but still consumed precious resources. But the hardship of survival cannibalism extended beyond the victims to the perpetrators. The neurological condition Kuru, a prion disease similar to Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, spreads through the consumption of human neural tissue. Some skeletal remains from Viking contexts show bone changes consistent with prion disease, suggesting the long-term consequences of consuming human brains or spinal tissue. The practice of survival cannibalism came with its own death sentence, a slow neurological deterioration that would eventually destroy the cannibal's mind. The psychological trauma must have been equally devastating. The knowledge of what one had done to survive, the breaking of perhaps the deepest human taboo. Perhaps most disturbing is evidence suggesting some instances of cannibalism weren't driven purely by survival desperation. At certain raid sites, human remains show processing patterns consistent with ritual consumption rather than starvation. The selection of specific body parts, the particular ways bones were treated, and the context suggest possible ritual or symbolic cannibalism associated with warfare and the cult of Odin, who was said to consume the flesh of the slain. The line between propaganda and reality, between myth and practice, becomes uncomfortably blurred. It's hard not to wonder how many other taboos, how many other boundaries of acceptable behaviour dissolved in the harsh realities of Viking Age survival. For decades, the conspiracy theory that Vikings systematically abandoned or killed their elderly and disabled members was dismissed as Christian propaganda designed to contrast pagan cruelty with Christian charity. The saga references to cenocide, the killing of the elderly, were interpreted as rare, extreme examples rather than common practice. Archaeological evidence of disabled individuals in Viking society was often cited as proof that Norse culture was inclusive and caring, that communities supported their vulnerable members. The theory that Vikings practiced eugenic selection, eliminating those who couldn't contribute labour or might burden resources, was considered too dark and too modern a concept to apply to medieval Scandinavia. Scholars insisted that Viking society, like all societies, cared for its weak. Imagine the reassessment that occurred when researchers began systematic analysis of Viking Age skeletal populations, examining not just the presence of disabled individuals but their age, at death, treatment and burial contexts. While some disabled individuals clearly survived to adulthood, receiving community support, a different pattern emerged for others. Skeletal remains showing congenital disabilities or severe injuries disproportionately appear in marginal burial locations, outside formal cemeteries, in unmarked graves, in positions suggesting casual disposal rather than ritual burial. The individuals buried this way often show signs of having survived their injuries or disabilities for only short periods, dying young despite conditions that wouldn't necessarily have been immediately fatal. The statistical analysis reveals something disturbing. Comparing survival rates of disabled individuals in Viking context to contemporary populations in Christian Europe shows significant differences. In Christian burial grounds, individuals with severe disabilities frequently survived to middle or old age, buried with full ritual honours. In Viking contexts, the same types of disabilities correlate with death in youth or early adulthood. At sites identified with periods of resource stress, during known famines or harsh winters, the proportion of disabled individuals in marginal burials increases dramatically. The pattern suggests active selection, communities making calculated decisions about who deserved resources and who didn't when survival became difficult. But the hardship of this practice extended beyond the immediate victims. The saga literature, once dismissed as fiction, contains specific accounts of elderly individuals voluntarily choosing death to avoid burdening their families, walking into the wilderness during winter, or leaping from cliffs in acts called etestupa. While some scholars still debate whether these were real practices or literary devices, the archaeological evidence increasingly supports their reality. At certain coastal sites in Norway and Sweden, concentrations of elderly skeletal remains have been found at the bases of cliffs, showing trauma consistent with falls from height. The dating clusters these deaths in winter months and periods of documented resource scarcity. The individuals show no signs of previous injury or mobility issues that would explain accidental falls, and the locations are places that would require deliberate effort to reach, not places one would accidentally wander. The voluntary nature of these deaths remains questionable. How voluntary can a choice be when the alternative is watching your family starve, when social pressure makes your continued existence a shame, when the culture offers no path except death for those who can no longer work? The skeletal evidence also reveals disabled children who didn't survive infancy, their bones showing no signs of care or healing attempts for their conditions. Infants born with visible disabilities appear to have been denied the food and care that would have allowed survival, dying from neglect if not outright infanticide. The burial patterns suggest these deaths weren't tragedies but expected outcomes. The bodies interred without ceremony or grave goods. Perhaps most disturbing is what this tells us about the razor's edge of survival in Viking society. The romanticised image of proud, independent Norse culture obscures the brutal calculations required to survive in marginal environments. Every mouth to feed was a resource calculation, every individual judged by their potential contribution versus their cost. It's hard not to wonder how many modern societies, pushed to similar extremes of scarcity, would make the same terrible choices. The conspiracy theory that Vikings engaged in systematic child marriage and sexual exploitation of minors was treated by scholars as either exaggeration or an unfair application of modern age of consent concepts to a medieval society where early marriage was normal across all cultures. The saga accounts describing marriages involving girls as young as 12 were acknowledged but contextualised as typical for the period, not evidence of particular Viking barbarity. The theory that Vikings specifically targeted children in slave raids for sexual exploitation was dismissed as propaganda. The archaeological evidence was considered ambiguous, unable to speak definitively about the ages at which sexual activity or marriage began. Scholars insisted that while Vikings had many brutal practices, child exploitation wasn't notably worse than in contemporary Christian societies. Picture, if you will, the skeletal remains of young females found in Viking burial contexts, whose bones tell a story that's impossible to dismiss or contextualise away. Pelvic analysis can reveal evidence of childbirth, showing characteristic scarring and bone changes that occur during pregnancy and delivery. When this analysis is applied to Viking Age female skeletons, Researchers have found evidence of childbirth in individuals whose bones show they hadn't yet completed skeletal maturation. Girls whose growth plates hadn't fully fused, indicating they were 13, 14 or 15 years old, show clear signs of having given birth. The physical stress this placed on developing bodies is visible in the bones themselves. Pelvic damage, spinal compression, and growth disruptions that reveal bodies forced into motherhood before they were physically ready. The mortality rates for these young mothers were catastrophic. Graves of adolescent females disproportionately contain evidence of death during or shortly after childbirth, their skeletons showing the characteristic signs of obstructed labour, pelvic trauma, or postpartum hemorrhage. The burial contexts often include infants who died alongside their mothers, double graves that speak to the brutal reality of childbirth for bodies too young for the process. At some sites, the proportion of teenage female graves that include evidence of pregnancy or childbirth complications exceeds 50%, a mortality rate that reveals systematic exploitation regardless of the consequences. But the hardship wasn't limited to formal marriage arrangements. The skeletal evidence from enslaved populations shows even younger victims. At sites identified as slaveholding centres, researchers have found the remains of prepubescent girls showing signs of sexual trauma. Pelvic injuries inconsistent with childbirth, but consistent with violent sexual assault, appear in skeletons of children as young as 8 or 9 years old. The healing patterns of these injuries suggest repeated trauma, not isolated incidents. The chemical analysis of these remains reveals they were foreign-born, taken from distant lands, their bodies exploited until they died from injury, disease, or the complications of pregnancies their bodies couldn't survive. The saga literature once dismissed becomes darkly illuminating in light of this evidence. Descriptions of concubines and enslaved women being given to warriors as young as puberty weren't metaphorical. Legal codes that set compensation prices for different types of sexual violence against enslaved girls weren't theoretical exercises. These were practical guidelines for a society where such exploitation was common enough to require price standardization. Perhaps most disturbing is the evidence of organised trafficking. The skeletal remains of young females found in trading centres show patterns suggesting systematic collection and distribution. Girls with diverse geographic origins, identifiable through isotope analysis and DNA, appear in concentrations that can't be explained except through organised trade in children for sexual exploitation. The ages, the contexts and the treatment of these remains reveal a commercial system built on child suffering, operating at scale across the Viking trade networks. It's hard not to wonder about the psychological damage, not just to the immediate victims, but to the societies that normalise such practices, the traders who handled children as merchandise, the communities that looked away while neighbouring children disappeared into slavery. The conspiracy theory that Vikings engaged in systematic violence against Christian clergy, specifically targeting priests, monks and nuns for torture and execution beyond simple looting, was dismissed by some scholars as exaggerated propaganda designed to justify Christian military responses. While no one denied that Vikings raided monasteries, the specific claims about deliberate cruelty toward religious figures were treated skeptically. The descriptions of priests being bound and drowned, monks being burned alive inside their churches, and nuns being subjected to sexual violence before execution were considered rhetorical excess by traumatized chroniclers. The theory that Vikings harboured specific religious hatred toward Christianity, that their violence against clergy was ideologically motivated rather than simply opportunistic, seemed too sophisticated, too theologically aware, for supposedly simple raiders interested only in gold. Imagine the excavations at monastery sites across the British Isles and Western Europe, where archaeological evidence has begun to paint a picture that confirms the most disturbing accounts. At Lindisfarne, the site of the famous 793 CE raid that marked the beginning of the Viking Age in England, excavations have revealed human remains showing specific patterns of violence concentrated on individuals whose burial, Locations and contexts identify them as clergy. The skeletal trauma isn't random combat injuries but deliberate methodical violence. Cut marks indicating beheading, fractures consistent with prolonged beating, and positioning suggesting bodies were mutilated after death. At the monastery of Iona in Scotland, raided repeatedly between 795 and 825 CE, excavations revealed mass graves containing monks whose remains show they were killed in groups, their bodies dumped without burial rites. The trauma patterns match the chronicle descriptions: skull fractures from blunt weapons, bound hands indicated by wristbone stress markers, and evidence of burning that suggests some were indeed set afire. At sites across Ireland, France, and England, similar patterns emerge. Monastic buildings show evidence of deliberate, systematic destruction that went beyond looting. Churches were burned with clear signs of accelerants being used, their stone walls pulled down through organised effort, their religious artefacts deliberately desecrated. Crucifixes and other Christian symbols are found broken in ways that suggest intentional destruction rather than casual damage. The archaeological evidence reveals this wasn't coincidental. The Vikings were making statements. But the hardship extended to female religious communities with particular brutality. At the sites of convents raided by Vikings, the skeletal evidence tells a story that matches the horrified descriptions in contemporary chronicles. The remains of nuns show patterns of perimortem pelvic trauma and rib fractures consistent with sexual violence, combined with evidence of execution-style killing. The burial context suggests these women were denied Christian burial rites, their bodies treated with deliberate contempt. The ages of the victims range from elderly women to girls barely into adolescence, all members of religious communities that were supposed to offer protection from exactly such violence. The documentary evidence, suddenly more credible in light of archaeological confirmation, reveals this violence had an ideological component. Saga literature describes warriors specifically targeting Christian symbols, boasting of drinking from communion chalices, urinating on altars, and forcing priests to renounce their faith before execution. Viking poetry celebrates the destruction of churches and the killing of clergy as demonstrations of Odin's superiority over Christ. This wasn't just opportunistic raiding, it was a deliberate assault on Christianity itself, a religious conflict that both sides understood as such. Perhaps most disturbing is the evidence that some clergy were kept alive specifically for torture and humiliation. Skeletal remains showing prolonged captivity, evidenced by vitamin deficiencies and bone changes that develop over months, appear in context suggesting these individuals were displayed, degraded, and eventually killed in ways designed to terrorize Christian communities. The chronicle accounts of priests being forced to participate in pagan rituals, to curse their own god, to watch their churches burn before being executed, are confirmed by archaeological context showing exactly this pattern: captivity, deliberate malnutrition, and eventual execution in ritual contexts. It's hard not to wonder what drove this specific cruelty, whether it was genuine religious conviction, political strategy, or simply the human capacity for finding reasons to dehumanize and destroy those marked as other by belief. The conspiracy theory that the Great Heathen Army's destruction across England from 865 to 878 CE was far more extensive than historical records suggested, that entire regions were deliberately depopulated and ecosystems permanently altered, was treated by many scholars as exaggeration of what was admittedly a significant but limited military campaign. The Anglo-Saxon chronicles' descriptions of wholesale devastation were assumed to reflect local trauma rather than comprehensive regional destruction. Archaeological evidence of the period was interpreted to show disruption, but not the apocalyptic scale destruction that conspiracy theorists claimed. The theory that the Vikings engaged in systematic genocide, deliberately eliminating entire populations in conquered territories, seemed too extreme for what was essentially a successful invasion and settlement. Imagine the revelations that emerge from systematic landscape archaeology projects conducted across eastern England in recent decades, using LIDAR technology to penetrate vegetation and reveal ground structures, combined with extensive excavation and analysis of settlement patterns. Researchers began to reconstruct what actually happened to the English populations in Viking-conquered territories. The results were staggering. In regions known to have been under Viking control, the archaeological record shows a near-complete break in settlement continuity. Villages that had existed continuously for centuries suddenly disappear from the record, their sites showing signs of violent destruction followed by abandonment. Not relocation, not gradual decline, but sudden, complete cessation of occupation. The paleoecological evidence tells the same story. Pollen records show agricultural land reverting to wilderness, cultivated fields becoming meadows and forests as no one remained to work them. The scale becomes clear when the data is compiled. Across significant portions of eastern England, perhaps tens of thousands of people simply vanish from the archaeological record during the period of Viking conquest. Their villages burn, their fields go fallow, their cemeteries stop receiving new burials. Where do these people go? The most optimistic interpretation is mass displacement, populations fleeing southward into regions still under English control. But the skeletal evidence suggests darker answers. Mass graves from this period, containing hundreds of individuals killed, simultaneously appear at multiple sites. At Ridgeway Hill in Dorset, excavators found 54 young men, all decapitated and buried together, their remains showing they were Scandinavian by genetic analysis. These were likely Viking raiders executed by English forces. But similar graves containing English individuals in Viking-controlled territories tell the other side of the story. The mortality patterns in English burial grounds that continue through the Viking period show dramatic spikes in violent death, malnutrition, and disease during and immediately after the conquest. But the hardship of this destruction wasn't just demographic, it was cultural and economic. The coin hoards buried during this period, hidden by people who never returned to reclaim them, contain the life savings of entire communities. The distribution and density of these hoards map directly onto the path of Viking armies, suggesting systematic looting that stripped regions of all portable wealth. The archaeological evidence shows sophisticated industries collapsing, pottery production centres going silent, metalworking sites abandoned, trade networks dissolving. Regions that had supported dense populations and complex economies were reduced to subsistence-level occupation or total abandonment. The genetic evidence adds another layer to the story. DNA analysis of modern English populations shows regional differences in Scandinavian ancestry that reflect the historical conquest pattern, but the proportions are revealing. In some areas, Scandinavian genetic markers approach 100% in certain communities, suggesting not settlement alongside existing populations but complete replacement. The original inhabitants were eliminated or driven out so thoroughly that their genetic legacy disappears from the record. This wasn't cultural mixing or peaceful settlement. This was conquest through annihilation. Perhaps most disturbing is the evidence that this destruction was deliberate policy, not collateral damage of warfare. The pattern is too consistent, too thorough to be accidental. Villages weren't just looted but burned to the ground. Agricultural infrastructure wasn't just disrupted but systematically destroyed. Populations weren't just conquered but eliminated. This saga literature, with its casual references to regions being cleansed or made empty by Viking armies, suddenly reads less like boasting and more like documentation. It's hard not to wonder how history would judge this period if it had occurred in a later, better documented age. How many of these actions would be categorized not as conquest, but as ethnic cleansing. The conspiracy theory that internal Viking violence, the blood feuds and vendettas within Norse society itself, killed more Vikings than external warfare ever did, was dismissed as impossible to quantify and probably exaggerated by saga literature that loved dramatic family conflicts. Scholars acknowledge that feuding existed but treated it as exceptional behaviour, dramatic episodes that punctuated otherwise normal social life. The theory that Norse society was locked in a cycle of reciprocal violence, that communities were systematically destroying themselves through intergenerational vengeance, that the social fabric was held together only by the promise of external raiding to redirect aggression outward, seemed too cynical, too modern in its analysis of dysfunction. After all, if internal violence was truly that catastrophic, how could Viking society have been so militarily successful abroad? Picture, if you will, the cemeteries excavated across Scandinavia, where careful analysis of trauma patterns reveals a disturbing picture of Viking-on-Viking violence. The skeletal remains show rates of perimortem trauma, injuries at or near time of death, that exceed even battlefield contexts from other periods. What makes this particularly significant is that many of these burials are in home regions, far from any external military conflicts, in cemeteries serving communities that were never sites of foreign invasion or warfare. The violence was internal, community members killing community members at rates that suggest endemic conflict. The types of injuries are revealing. These aren't the wounds of organised battlefield combat, but of ambushes, tavern brawls and assassination. Blows to the back of the head, stab wounds between the ribs from behind, fractures suggesting someone was struck while drinking or eating. The weapons used match those found in everyday domestic contexts, not specialised military equipment. This was violence woven into the fabric of daily life. The burial patterns show concentrations of violent death in certain family plots, multi-generational graves where fathers, sons and grandsons all died from perimortem trauma. Their deaths sometimes separated by years or decades, but part of the same ongoing conflict. The genetic analysis of these family groups confirms they were closely related, and the timing patterns match the saga descriptions of feuds that continued across generations, each death requiring revenge, each revenge triggering the next cycle. But the hardship of this violence extended beyond the immediate casualties to the complete social disruption it caused. The archaeological record shows farms abandoned not because of agricultural failure, but because all adult males in the family were killed in feuds. Legal documents that survive from the later Viking Age describe compensation systems that have become impossibly complex, attempting to quantify in silver the value of every type of insult, injury or death to prevent feuds from escalating. The very existence of these elaborate legal codes proves how desperately society was trying to control violence that threatened to tear it apart. The survival of the legal framework itself is evidence that the violence was considered a critical social problem, not an unfortunate but manageable aspect of life. The sagas, suddenly more credible as historical sources, describe communities where no family was safe from feuds, where marriages were strategic alliances designed to end or prevent conflicts, where moving to Iceland or other new territories was often motivated less by seeking opportunity and more by fleeing vendettas. The archaeological evidence supports this. The settlement patterns in Iceland show clusters of families from the same Norwegian regions settling together, often identified in saga literature as fleeing the same feuds. These weren't adventurous pioneers seeking new beginnings. They were refugees from their own society's violence. Perhaps most disturbing is the evidence that Viking raiding culture, the external violence that defined the age, may have been partially a pressure release mechanism for societies that would otherwise have consumed themselves entirely. The chronology is suggestive. Periods when external raiding opportunities declined correspond to spikes in internal violence markers in home cemeteries. When warriors couldn't direct their aggression outward, they turned it on each other. The systematic violence against external enemies may have been the only thing preventing complete internal collapse. It's hard not to wonder what it did to a society's collective psychology, to live in a state where every interaction with neighbours and family carried the potential for lethal violence, where every death demanded revenge and every revenge created new enemies, where peace was impossible because honour required violence. The conspiracy theory that Viking judicial punishment methods were far more brutal and torturous than legal code suggested, that the clean executions and financial compensations described in law were facades covering systematic torture and mutilation, was dismissed by scholars who pointed to the sophistication of Norse legal systems. The Thing assemblies and their complex legal procedures were held up as evidence of a culture that valued justice and rule of law. The saga descriptions of blood eagles, deliberate infection of wounds, and prolonged executions were treated as literary embellishments, too grotesque to reflect actual legal practice. The theory that Vikings institutionalised torture as punishment was considered contradicted by their own law codes, which emphasised compensation and exile over corporal punishment. Surely a society that had developed such elaborate legal frameworks wouldn't resort to medieval horror show executions. Imagine the growing discomfort among scholars as skeletal evidence began emerging from execution sites across Scandinavia. At Trelleborg and other sites, researchers found remains showing patterns of violence that exceeded what would be necessary for simple execution. Individuals with multiple types of perimortem trauma, suggesting they were injured in several different ways before death. Bodies showing signs of sustained torture, broken fingers and toes that don't occur in combat, rib, fractures that suggest prolonged beating, and healing patterns that prove some injuries were deliberately inflicted days or weeks before death. The victim kept alive specifically to prolong suffering. The burial contexts confirm these weren't battlefield casualties but judicial executions, buried in specific areas designated for criminals, and those denied normal funerary rites. The most disturbing evidence comes from remains showing the infamous Blood Eagle execution. For years, scholars debated whether this method, described in sagas as breaking the ribs away from the spine and pulling the lungs out to create the image of wings, was even physically possible. A skeleton found at a site in Lund, Sweden, finally provided the answer. The remains showed precisely the pattern of rib damage described in saga literature: posterior rib fractures near the spine, characteristic marks on vertebrae, and positioning consistent with the organs being removed before death. The individual was alive during the process. The bone healing patterns prove it wasn't post-mortem mutilation. The Blood Eagle wasn't poetic metaphor, it was documented reality. But the hardship of judicial torture extended beyond these extreme ritual executions. The skeletal evidence reveals routine mutilation as punishment. Hands severed at the wrist, feet cut off, eyes deliberately destroyed through orbital fractures, tongues removed indicated by specific mandible damage. Legal codes that survive from later Viking age mention these punishments, but frame them as exceptional. The archaeological evidence suggests they were common. The distribution of mutilated remains across everyday cemeteries indicates that people living with these deliberate injuries were part of normal community life, their maimed bodies serving as permanent visible warnings of the consequences of transgression. The saga literature describes specific torture methods: slow hanging where victims were suspended until they strangled over hours or days, exposure to elements in wooden frames called stakes, deliberate infection of wounds by coating them with soil and excrement. Archaeological contexts have begun confirming these practices, remains showing non-lethal injuries that became severely infected, with bone changes proving the infection was developing while the victim still lived. Burial positions suggesting bodies were left in specific postures until death occurred naturally from exposure or infection. Evidence of binding methods that would cause increasing pain as victims struggled. Perhaps most disturbing is evidence that torture and execution were public spectacles, social events that brought communities together. The archaeological context of execution sites shows surrounding areas with evidence of large gatherings, food consumption, and what appears to be festival atmosphere around judicial killings. The torture of criminals wasn't hidden away but celebrated, an entertainment and a warning combined. The skeletons of executed individuals sometimes show evidence they were displayed after death. Bones bearing weathering patterns consistent with exposure before burial. It's hard not to wonder about the psychological impact of growing up in a society where torture was routine, where communal identity was reinforced through watching neighbours be mutilated, where the law's authority rested not on abstract justice, but on the graphic demonstration of what happened to those who violated social norms. The conspiracy theory that Viking treatment of prisoners of war went far beyond simple enslavement or execution, that they maintained systematic programs of degradation and dehumanization designed to break captives psychologically before determining their fate, was dismissed as impossible to prove archaeologically and probably invented by Christian propagandists. The saga descriptions of captives being forced to perform degrading acts, subjected to ritualized humiliation, and kept in conditions designed to destroy their sense of self, were treated as literary devices emphasizing the power differential between captor and captive. The theory that Vikings operated something resembling what modern scholars would call psychological warfare against their prisoners seemed too sophisticated, too deliberately cruel for what was assumed to be a relatively straightforward culture of raiders and warriors. Picture, if you will, the excavations at sites identified as temporary Viking military camps, where researchers have found evidence of captive holding facilities that reveal systematic cruelty. At a site in England corresponding to the Great Army's winter quarters, archaeologists discovered pit structures showing evidence of human occupation, but no heating, minimal space, and waste accumulation consistent with captives being held in their own filth. The skeletal remains found associated with these structures show patterns of malnutrition and disease that developed over weeks or months. Not the immediate death of execution, but the slow degradation of prolonged captivity in deliberately harsh conditions. The bone chemistry reveals these individuals were fed minimally, given just enough food to keep them alive but not to maintain health. The dental calculus from these remains contains evidence of a diet radically different from both normal Viking and normal English diets of the period, suggesting captives were fed specific degrading substances. Analysis has found remains of plants and animals that weren't part of normal human consumption, foods that would have been actively unpleasant or disgusting to eat. This wasn't efficient provision of cheap food, this was deliberate humiliation through forcing captives to consume things that violated their cultural norms and human dignity. The saga literature describes prisoners being forced to eat food contaminated with urine, being made to consume parts of animals considered taboo, being fed rotten or spoiled provisions while their captors ate well. The skeletal and chemical evidence confirms these accounts, but the hardship of Viking captivity extended to systematic physical degradation beyond minimal nutrition. Skeletal remains from captive contexts show evidence of deliberate minor injuries that don't threaten life but cause permanent damage and ongoing pain. Broken fingers that weren't set, deliberately dislocated joints, burns that suggest torture or punishment, dental damage consistent with teeth being broken on purpose. The pattern suggests a program of incremental violence designed to demonstrate complete control over the prisoner's body. The psychological purpose seems clear. Break the captive's will, eliminate any sense of autonomy or hope, transform them from a person into property. The burial patterns reveal the ultimate fate of many captives. At mass grave sites associated with Viking camps, researchers have found remains showing that captives were sometimes killed in groups after being held for extended periods. The killing methods suggest execution, not combat, precise cuts to the neck, positioning indicating they were restrained during death, no defensive wounds suggesting they didn't fight back. These weren't battlefield casualties, but people whose spirits had been so thoroughly broken that they accepted death without resistance. The chemical analysis of their bones shows stress markers consistent with prolonged psychological trauma, the body's physical response to sustained fear, and hopelessness. Perhaps most disturbing is evidence that some captives were kept specifically for entertainment or experimentation. Saga accounts describe prisoners being forced to fight each other, to perform humiliating acts, to serve as practice targets for warriors. Skeletal remains showing multiple non-lethal injuries sustained over time, the kinds of wounds consistent with being struck repeatedly with controlled force, support these accounts. Remains showing evidence of progressive mutilation, with healing patterns proving the individual survived multiple sessions of deliberate injury, suggest some captives were indeed used for prolonged degradation rather than being immediately enslaved or executed. It's hard not to wonder about the long-term psychological impact on those captives who survived to be enslaved or ransomed. What it did to a person's psyche to be systematically dehumanized, to have their body and dignity treated as playthings, to learn through direct experience that they had no control over anything, not even their own physical integrity. The conspiracy theory that Vikings engaged in deliberate religious persecution of other pagan traditions, that their violence wasn't limited to Christians, but extended to other pre-Christian religions that competed with Norse beliefs, was dismissed as anachronistic projection of later religious conflicts onto a period that supposedly practiced pagan tolerance. Scholars insisted that pre-Christian religions were inherently pluralistic, that the conflict between Norse and Christian belief was unique due to Christianity's exclusivist claims. The theory that Vikings destroyed Sami sacred sites, persecuted Baltic pagan traditions, and engaged in religious violence against other pagan peoples seemed to misunderstand the nature of pre-Christian religious life. Surely pagans didn't persecute other pagans. Imagine the discomfort when archaeological evidence began revealing a different picture. At sites in northern Scandinavia associated with Sami religious practice, researchers found evidence of deliberate destruction dating to the Viking Age, long before Christian conversion could explain it. Siedi stones, sacred rocks that were central to Sami spiritual practice, show signs of being deliberately toppled, smashed or defaced during the period of Norse expansion northward. The pattern is too consistent to be natural damage or coincidental. At drum sites, locations where Sami Noaidi shamans performed rituals, excavations revealed systematic burning and desecration that predates Christian missions by centuries. The archaeological context clearly indicates this destruction occurred during Norse settlement expansion, not during later Christian conversion campaigns. The skeletal evidence from Sami burial grounds in areas that came under Norse control tells a story of sudden, violent disruption. Graves showing traditional Sami burial practices abruptly stop, replaced by either Norse-style burials or no formal burials at all. The transition isn't gradual cultural mixing but sudden cessation, suggesting populations were either displaced, killed, or forcibly converted to Norse religious practices. At some sites, Sami graves show signs of later disturbance by Norse settlers, sacred sites deliberately violated, burial goods removed, bones scattered. This wasn't grave robbing for valuables, it was desecration of religious significance. But the hardship of Norse religious intolerance extended beyond the Sami to other peoples. In regions where Norse settlers encountered Baltic and Slavic pagan traditions, the archaeological record shows similar patterns of deliberate destruction of religious sites. Sacred groves were cut down, evidenced by paleoecological data showing sudden forest clearance at locations later identified in historical sources as pagan worship sites. Temple foundations show signs of deliberate dismantling during Norse expansion periods, their stones scattered or used for Norse construction projects. The message was clear. Norse religious practices would dominate, other traditions would be eliminated. The saga literature, once dismissed as reflecting only Christian-pagan conflict, contains references to violence against other pagan peoples explicitly motivated by religious difference. Descriptions of warriors destroying the sacred sites of peoples they conquered, forcing adoption of Norse religious practices, and killing those who refused to participate in Norse Religious ceremonies. The archaeological evidence increasingly supports these accounts. At settlement sites where Norse colonizers encountered indigenous pagan populations, the material culture shows abrupt changes suggesting forced cultural assimilation. Local religious artifacts disappear from the archaeological record, replaced entirely by Norse religious objects. Perhaps most disturbing is the evidence that Norse religious violence could be internal as well. As Norse society began fragmenting into regional variations, with different communities emphasizing different gods or practicing distinct ritual traditions, the archaeological record shows conflict that may have had religious dimensions, sites showing sudden violent destruction in contexts where there was no external enemy present, where the destruction targeted specifically religious structures while leaving secular buildings relatively intact. The theory that Viking Age Scandinavia was torn by religious conflicts between different Norse factions, perhaps between Odin worshippers and Thor worshippers, or between those practicing more archaic traditions and those adopting newer practices, remains controversial. But the pattern of violence targeting religious sites, even when those sites were Norse, suggests that religious difference was already a source of conflict before Christianity arrived. It's hard not to wonder whether the eventual conversion to Christianity was less a dramatic transformation and more a continuation of existing patterns of religious violence, merely redirecting aggression that had always existed from one set of targets to another. The conspiracy theory that Vikings deliberately bred enslaved populations like livestock, selecting individuals for specific traits and controlling reproduction to produce more valuable human commodities, was dismissed as too industrialised, too modern a concept to apply to medieval society. Scholars acknowledged that enslaved people were bought and sold, that their children inherited enslaved status, but the theory of deliberate selective breeding seemed to require a level of systematic planning and eugenic thinking that supposedly didn't exist before the modern era. The saga references to enslaved women being valued for their ability to produce strong children, to men being selected for size and strength, were interpreted as casual observations, not evidence of systematic breeding programs. The theory that Vikings operated human breeding operations comparable to animal husbandry was considered offensive anachronism, projecting later atrocities onto a period that, while brutal, surely didn't engage in quite that level of calculated dehumanization. Picture, if you will, the genetic laboratories where researchers analysed DNA from skeletal remains found at major Viking trading centres, particularly sites like Hedeby and Birka, where the slave trade was concentrated. The results reveal patterns that are difficult to explain except through deliberate reproductive control. In populations identified as enslaved through burial context and skeletal markers of hard labour, researchers found genetic signatures showing limited diversity in ways that don't occur naturally. The male lineages show bottlenecking, where a small number of men contributed disproportionately to the gene pool, while female lineages show greater diversity, exactly the pattern that emerges when breeding is controlled, when specific males are selected for reproduction, while others are prevented from having children. The genetic analysis also reveals selection for specific physical traits. Enslaved populations show higher frequencies of genes associated with larger body size, greater muscle mass, and other characteristics that would make individuals more valuable as labourers. This isn't natural selection. The environmental pressures of enslavement should have selected for survival traits like disease resistance, not labour capacity. The only explanation is artificial selection, humans making breeding decisions based on desired offspring characteristics. The skeletal remains themselves support this interpretation, showing enslaved populations developing distinct morphological characteristics over generations, bodies shaped by deliberate human selection, just as surely as domesticated animals were shaped by breeding programs. But the hardship of these breeding programs was profound and intimate. The documentary evidence, suddenly more credible, describes enslaved women being forced to mate with specific men selected by their owners. Legal codes include provisions for the ownership of children born to enslaved women. specifying that offspring belong to the woman's owner regardless of the father's status. Saga literature casually mentions enslaved women being given to particular men to breed, describes the children of such unions being evaluated for quality, references enslaved people being sold based on their breeding history and the characteristics of their previous offspring. The skeletal evidence reveals the physical toll, enslaved women showing evidence of numerous pregnancies spaced closely together without the recovery time that would be natural. The bone chemistry reveals chronic nutritional stress concentrated in women of childbearing age, their bodies depleted by repeated pregnancy and lactation while being fed minimally. Infant mortality rates in enslaved populations were catastrophic, evidenced by the concentration of infant and child burials in enslaved contexts. These weren't children being raised by families who valued them. These were breeding experiments where many offspring didn't survive, and those who did were evaluated for their utility. Perhaps most disturbing is evidence that some enslaved populations were bred for specific markets. Genetic analysis shows distinct lineages associated with different trading centres, suggesting specialised breeding operations. Some populations show selection for traits that would make individuals suitable for domestic service, smaller stature, less aggressive morphological indicators. Others show selection for heavy labour, larger frames, robust bone structure. The Vikings weren't just trading in humans, they were manufacturing humans tailored to market demands. The DNA evidence reveals long-term breeding programs spanning multiple generations, genetic signatures proving the same family lines were kept in enslavement for centuries, their reproduction controlled, their children born into a system that treated them as agricultural products. It's hard not to wonder about the psychological reality of being bred like livestock, of knowing your children were property before they were even born, of understanding that your body's reproductive capacity was owned by someone else, that even the most intimate aspects of life were controlled by market forces and owner calculations. The conspiracy theory that Vikings deliberately erased evidence of their own crimes, destroying records, altering burial practices and covering up their most extreme violence to control their historical narrative, was dismissed as implausibly sophisticated for a supposedly pre-literate warrior culture. Scholars insisted that Vikings simply didn't have the literacy or historical consciousness to engage in deliberate historical revisionism. The gaps in the archaeological record were explained as natural preservation issues, not intentional destruction of evidence. The theory that Vikings understood how they would be remembered and actively shape that memory by eliminating traces of their worst actions seemed to credit them with a level of self-awareness and long-term planning that contradicted the image of impulsive, present-focused raiders. After all, why would warriors who boasted of their violence in saga literature simultaneously try to hide evidence of that same violence? Imagine the moment when researchers began noticing suspicious patterns in the archaeological record, absences that seemed too deliberate to be accidental. At sites where documentary evidence clearly indicated massacres or mass enslavement occurred, the physical evidence was often missing. No mass graves where chronicles said thousands died. No concentrations of burned remains where sources described wholesale slaughter. The absence itself began to seem like evidence. When excavations finally located some of these missing graves, they found something revealing. Signs of later disturbance dating to the Viking Age itself, evidence that graves had been deliberately excavated, remains removed or scattered, and the sites carefully concealed. The bones weren't lost to time, they were hidden by the people who created them. The most compelling evidence comes from sites where partial cover-ups were incomplete or unsuccessful. At several locations, researchers found primary burial sites that had been deliberately emptied, with secondary deposits some distance away where the removed remains were haphazardly reburied in obscure locations. The pattern suggests someone returned to massacre sites, possibly years or decades later, and attempted to erase the physical evidence. The effort wasn't random but systematic, targeting specifically the sites where the violence had been most extreme, where the number of victims would have been most damning. chemical analysis of soil at documented massacre locations shows elevated phosphate levels and other markers of human decomposition, confirming bodies were once present at sites where no remains currently exist. But the hardship of this historical erasure extended beyond just hiding bodies. There's evidence Vikings engaged in deliberate destruction of their own material culture when it documented uncomfortable truths. At some sites, rune stones that recorded events were deliberately defaced or destroyed, their fragments scattered or buried. The patterns of damage suggest intentional obliteration of text rather than natural weathering. When fragments can be reconstructed, some reveal references to violence, enslavement, or actions that later generations apparently wish to forget. The sagas themselves show signs of editing and revision, with earlier versions preserved in fragments containing accounts that later standardized texts softened or eliminated entirely. The conspiracy theory becomes darker when examining burial practices. There's evidence that some individuals who died through particularly shameful means, perhaps executed for crimes, killed in feuds that reflected poorly on their families, or who were victims of violence that survivors wanted hidden, were buried in ways designed to prevent later discovery. Deep burials in isolated locations, graves deliberately placed in areas likely to be disturbed by erosion or agriculture, bodies disposed of in waterways or bogs where preservation would be poor. The skeletal remains that do survive from these contexts often lack the grave goods or markers that would identify who they were, a deliberate anonymization that served to erase their stories. Perhaps most disturbing is evidence that this historical manipulation continued through the Christian conversion period and beyond. As Norse society transitioned to Christianity and began producing written records more systematically, there are signs of deliberate historical revisionism in how the pagan period was described. Early Christian Icelandic writers, themselves descended from Viking Age families, produced saga literature that, while preserving many traditions, also showed signs of sanitizing or romanticizing certain aspects of ancestral behavior. The archaeological evidence increasingly reveals gaps between saga accounts and physical reality, with sagas often minimizing violence, omitting references to slavery, or presenting idealized versions of events that the ground itself contradicts. The conspiracy theorists were right. Vikings engaged in historical manipulation, trying to control how future generations would remember them. It's hard not to wonder what else remains hidden, what other evidence was successfully destroyed, what truths were erased so completely that we don't even know to look for them, what the full reality of Viking violence would look like if all the deliberately hidden evidence could somehow be recovered. The conspiracy theory that Viking expansion was driven not primarily by adventure or economic opportunity, but by environmental catastrophe and resource depletion in Scandinavia, that the raids and settlements were desperate survival measures by populations facing collapse at home, was dismissed by scholars who preferred to emphasize Norse agency and ambition. The theory painted Vikings as refugees rather than conquerors, victims of circumstance rather than masters of their fate, and this seemed to diminish their historical significance. Scholars acknowledged that environmental factors played some role, but insisted the primary drivers were cultural, technological, and social, rather than environmental desperation. The conspiracy theory that Scandinavia was experiencing a slow-motion ecological and agricultural crisis that made expansion a matter of survival rather than choice seemed too deterministic, removing human agency from historical narrative. Picture, if you will, the ice core data extracted from Greenland glaciers, containing a year-by-year record of atmospheric conditions stretching back millennia. When analysed, these cores reveal that the Viking Age began during a period of climatic deterioration in northern Europe. The medieval warm period, often credited with enabling Viking expansion, was regionally variable, and Scandinavia experienced significant climatic instability, including harvest failures, temperature drops, and increased storm frequency. The The tree ring data from Scandinavian forests corroborates this, showing patterns of stress, reduced growth, and widespread die-off during the decades immediately preceding and during the early Viking Age. The environmental pressure was real and severe. The paleoecological evidence from Scandinavia itself tells a story of agricultural crisis. Pollen cores show declining cereal cultivation in many regions, fields being abandoned, agricultural land reverting to wilderness. The soil chemistry reveals nutrient depletion, accumulated salinity from over-farming, and erosion patterns consistent with desperate attempts to farm marginal land unsuitable for agriculture. This wasn't a population choosing to expand out of ambition. This was a population running out of viable farmland at home. The skeletal evidence from pre-raid Scandinavia shows populations under severe nutritional stress. The generations immediately before Viking expansion began to show declining health markers, increased rates of childhood malnutrition, shorter average stature indicating poor nutrition during growth periods, and higher rates of deficiency diseases. But the hardship wasn't just environmental but demographic. Scandinavia's population had been growing steadily during the centuries before the Viking Age, and the available agricultural technology couldn't sustain the population levels that had developed. The archaeological evidence shows increasing settlement density, subdivision of farms into smaller plots, and exploitation of increasingly marginal land unsuitable for productive farming. When climate stress hit this overextended population, the result was crisis. The documentary evidence, sparse for early Viking Age Scandinavia, but increasing over time, describes famines, crop failures, and social upheaval. The same sources that describe Viking raids abroad also describe desperate conditions at home. The timing is revealing. The first major Viking raids coincide precisely with documented harvest failures in Scandinavia. This wasn't coincidence. The raids were survival strategy. The genetic evidence adds another dimension. DNA analysis of early Viking Age skeletons shows population bottlenecking in some Scandinavian regions, indicating mortality events that killed significant portions of the population. The survivors of these demographic crashes would have faced impossible situations. Too few people to work available land, disrupted family structures, collapsed local economies. Expansion wasn't ambition, it was necessity. For young men facing starvation at home with no prospect of inheriting viable farms, raiding wasn't adventure, but the only available survival strategy. Perhaps most disturbing is the realization that Viking violence abroad may have been directly proportional to desperation at home. The most intensive raiding periods correspond to the worst environmental conditions in Scandinavia. When conditions at home improved, raiding intensity decreased. The pattern suggests Viking raiders weren't seeking glory or wealth primarily, but food, land and resources to send or bring back to starving communities. The saga literature describes warriors returning home with grain, livestock and captives who could work land that lay fallow for lack of labourers. This wasn't conquest for its own sake. It was resource extraction driven by environmental and demographic catastrophe. The conspiracy theory proved true, but acknowledging it doesn't excuse the violence. If anything, it makes the brutality more comprehensible and more tragic. People facing starvation and social collapse turned their desperation outward, visiting on others the suffering they were experiencing. The victims of Viking raids weren't suffering for Norse glory but for Norse survival. It's hard not to wonder how different the Viking Age would have been if Scandinavia had possessed more stable agriculture, better land, milder climate. Whether the entire period of raids and violence was fundamentally a story of environmental crisis, transforming desperate people into perpetrators of desperate violence. The conspiracy theory that the famous Viking ship, burials, often presented as dignified honours for great leaders, frequently involved unwilling human sacrifice, and that the honoured dead sometimes weren't honoured at all, but killed and displayed in death as warnings or propaganda, was dismissed as impossible to prove and contradicted by the careful, elaborate nature of the burials themselves. Scholars pointed to the wealth of grave goods, the labour invested in burial preparations, and the prominent locations of many ship burials, as evidence these were respectful interments of important people. The theory that some ship burials were actually elaborate executions, political statements, or posthumous humiliations disguised as honours seemed too cynical. Surely the physical evidence of care and burial preparation indicated genuine respect for the deceased. Imagine the revelations emerging from detailed forensic analysis of remains from famous ship burial sites. At Oseberg in Norway, one of the most celebrated Viking ship burials, containing 2 women and extraordinary grave goods, careful reanalysis of the skeletal remains revealed disturbing details previously overlooked or explained away. One of the women showed signs of perimortem trauma, injuries at or very near time of death that suggested violent killing. The trauma patterns weren't consistent with accident or natural death, but with deliberate execution. The burial, long interpreted as a queen and her servant or 2 royal women buried together, may have involved one individual being killed to accompany the other into death, exactly as the dismissed conspiracy theories had suggested. Similar patterns appear at other ship burial sites, at Gokstad, at Thun, and at smaller ship burials across Scandinavia. Detailed re-examination of remains shows a disturbing percentage include individuals who died violently at or near the time of burial. But not all these individuals were sacrificial victims in the sense of servants killed to accompany masters. Some showed signs of execution-style deaths, and their burial positioning, initially interpreted as respectful placement, may have actually been restraint. Bodies positioned in ways that look ceremonial might have been tied or weighted, preventing any possibility of the deceased walking as Draugr or returning to haunt the living. The elaborate graves might have been as much about containing dangerous dead as honouring them. But the hardship of ship burial analysis becomes darker when examining the honoured primary interments themselves. Some show signs that they died from poisoning, evidenced by bone chemistry and characteristic skeletal changes. The presence of toxic plant materials and grave goods, initially interpreted as medicinal or ritual items, may have been the instruments of the person's death. The theory that some ship burials were elaborate assassination funerals, where inconvenient leaders were poisoned and then given ostentatious burials to prevent questions or rebellion, is supported by suspicious death patterns among individuals buried with greatest honour. The most disturbing evidence comes from the slave sacrifices that accompanied ship burials. Ibn Fadlan's famous account of a Volga ship burial, describing a slave girl being killed to accompany her master, was long treated as possibly exaggerated. Archaeological evidence increasingly confirms the practice. At multiple ship burial sites, researchers have found remains of individuals showing no signs of disease or age-related death but clear evidence of violent killing. These individuals, buried with great material wealth, weren't honoured, they were murdered. The grave goods weren't gifts, but the price of their deaths. The psychological horror of knowing you would be killed and buried with your owner must have been overwhelming. Perhaps most disturbing is evidence that some ship burials involve still living people being sealed into burial mounds. At several sites, skeletal remains show positioning and preservation suggesting the individuals were alive when the burial mound was closed. The oxygen-poor environment of sealed mounds means death would have come slowly through suffocation. The remains show desperate final movements, attempts to escape visible in the disturbed positioning of bones. The elaborate ship burials presented in museums as tributes to Viking greatness may have been chambers of suffocation where people died slowly in darkness, buried alive with the corpses they were meant to serve in the afterlife. The conspiracy theory proved true, revealing that the most celebrated archaeological evidence of Viking culture contained evidence of sacrificial murder, political assassination, and possibly the most terrifying death imaginable: conscious burial. It's hard not to wonder how many museum displays presenting these burials as cultural treasures are actually displaying crime scenes. How many carefully preserved artifacts are murder weapons? How many remains labelled as honoured dead were actually victims? The conspiracy theory that Viking traders and raiders spread across the medieval world not just through maritime routes, but through far more extensive networks than traditional histories acknowledged, that they reached deep into Asia, possibly even to China, and established trading posts in locations that would seem impossible without modern navigation, was dismissed as fringe speculation based on anomalous artifacts and wishful thinking. Mainstream archaeology acknowledged Viking presence as far as Constantinople and the Caspian Sea, but drew the line at claims of more extensive Asian penetration. The theories about Viking artifacts in China, about Norse trading posts in Central Asia, about possible Norse presence in India were considered conspiracy nonsense, based on misidentified objects or contaminated contexts. The scholarly consensus held that Vikings, while remarkable sailors and traders, had clear geographic limits. Picture, if you will, the moment when researchers analysing burial goods from the famous Oseberg ship burial and other high-status Viking graves began to identify the true origins of certain materials through modern isotope and chemical analysis. They found silk that wasn't Byzantine but Chinese, its composition matching silk production techniques specific to Tang Dynasty China. They found spices that could only have come from India or Southeast Asia. They found a Buddha statue, small but unmistakably Buddhist in origin, carved in a style placing its manufacture in northern India or Afghanistan. These weren't items that travelled through multiple intermediaries over vast distances. The freshness of dyes, the specific patterns of trade goods, and the combinations of items suggested direct trade contact. When DNA analysis was applied to Viking Age remains from various locations, researchers found something even more startling. At several Scandinavian sites, individuals with East Asian genetic markers appeared in burial contexts dated to the Viking Age. These weren't modern contamination or later period burials incorrectly dated. These were people of Asian ancestry living in Scandinavia during the 9th and 10th centuries, intermarrying with Norse populations integrated into Viking society. The genetic evidence suggested bidirectional contact, not just Vikings travelling east but Asians travelling west, creating connections that traditional histories insisted were impossible. But the hardship of these extended trading routes becomes clear when examining the skeletal remains of individuals who engaged in long-distance trade. Isotope analysis reveals traders whose chemical signatures show they travelled thousands of miles over their lifetimes, their bones recording journeys from Scandinavia to Asia and back. The physical toll was devastating. These travellers show patterns of disease exposure unusual for medieval Scandinavians, parasites specific to tropical regions, diseases common in Central Asia, health complications consistent with exposure to unfamiliar pathogens across vast geographic ranges. The mortality rates for long-distance traders were catastrophic, their life expectancy years shorter than Vikings who stayed in familiar regions. The documentary evidence, suddenly more credible, includes Arabic accounts of Rus traders appearing in markets as far east as Samarkand and possibly beyond. These accounts describe Norse traders operating along the Silk Road, interacting with Chinese merchants and facilitating exchange between the medieval Islamic world and East Asia. The accounts were dismissed as exaggeration or misidentification, but archaeological evidence increasingly supports them. At trading centres along ancient Silk Road routes, researchers have found artefacts that match Scandinavian design and manufacturing techniques, evidence that Norse traders penetrated far into Central Asia. Perhaps most disturbing is what this extended contact reveals about Viking trading practices at global scale. The enslaved people trafficked by Vikings weren't just moved within Europe but exported into Asian markets. Genetic evidence suggests individuals of Slavic, Celtic, and even African origin were transported along Viking trading routes into Central Asia and possibly beyond. The scale of this human trafficking operation, stretching from Ireland to China, represents perhaps the most extensive pre-modern slave trading network, rivaling anything that would emerge in later centuries. The conspiracy theory proved true, revealing that Viking commercial reach was far more extensive than acknowledged. But this wasn't a story of cultural exchange and cooperation. It was a story of exploitation at continental scale, of trading networks built on human suffering, of the commodification of people extended across the known world. The Vikings weren't just European raiders, they were international traders in human misery. It's hard not to wonder how many other aspects of Viking presence remain undiscovered, how many locations still contain evidence of Norse contact waiting to be recognised, how much more extensive their networks actually were than even the revised understanding acknowledges, what the full map of Viking Age connections would look like if all the deliberately hidden or lost evidence could somehow be recovered. The conspiracy theory that Viking conversion to Christianity wasn't the gradual peaceful process often depicted, but involved systematic violence against those who refused conversion, that Christian Vikings engaged in brutal persecution of pagans that matched or exceeded earlier pagan persecution of Christians, was dismissed by scholars who portrayed Christianization as a relatively smooth transition driven by royal decree and missionary work. The accounts describing forced baptisms, destruction of pagan sites by converts, and violence against those who maintained traditional beliefs were minimized as exceptional incidents or political conflicts with religious pretexts, rather than genuine religious persecution. The theory that Christianity arrived in Scandinavia through coercion and violence, as much as persuasion, seemed to contradict narratives of peaceful conversion that both church histories and modern scholarship preferred to emphasize. Picture, if you will, the archaeological evidence emerging from sites across newly Christian Scandinavia, showing patterns of violence that correspond precisely with conversion periods. At traditional pagan worship sites, excavations reveal sudden, catastrophic destruction, dated to the late 10th and early 11th centuries, the exact period of aggressive Christianization under rulers like Olaf Tryggvason of Norway and Olaf Haraldsson, who would later be sainted. The destruction wasn't gradual abandonment as populations lost interest in old ways, but violent, deliberate annihilation. Sacred groves were burned, their ancient trees cut and the stumps deliberately burned. Temple sites were dismantled, their materials scattered, or used to build Christian churches literally on top of pagan foundations, a symbolic and physical domination. The continuity of ritual practice at these sites, sometimes stretching back millennia, was ended not through cultural evolution but through force. The skeletal evidence is even more disturbing. In burial grounds dating to the conversion period, researchers have found individuals who continue to be buried with pagan grave goods, showing signs of violent death. The trauma patterns suggest execution, beheadings, blunt force trauma to the back of the skull, multiple simultaneous wounds indicating group violence. These weren't casualties of warfare or accidents, but deliberate killings. The burial contexts, often in marginal locations outside emerging Christian cemeteries, suggest these were people killed for maintaining pagan practices and denied Christian burial as both punishment and warning. But the hardship of Christian conversion wasn't just violence against pagans, but systematic destruction of cultural memory. The documentary evidence describes the burning of traditional texts, the destruction of runestones containing pagan religious content, and the suppression of traditional poetry and storytelling that preserved pre-Christian traditions. The archaeological record confirms this cultural genocide. Concentrations of destroyed runestones, their fragments deliberately scattered or buried, cluster in regions and periods associated with aggressive Christianization. Some fragments, when reconstructed, reveal religious content that was apparently intolerable to Christian authorities. The survival of Norse mythology and saga literature is often celebrated, but what survives is what Christians allowed to survive: filtered through Christian scribes who edited, modified, or eliminated content they found objectionable. What was lost is impossible to quantify, but was certainly vast. The saga literature itself, written down during Christian period by Christian authors, contains accounts of the conversion violence that were impossible to entirely suppress. Descriptions of Olaf Tryggvason torturing people who refused baptism, burning them alive, drowning them, or mutilating them until they accepted Christianity. Accounts of entire communities being given the choice between conversion and death. Stories of pagan religious leaders being hunted down and executed, their sacred objects destroyed, their followers scattered. These accounts were often framed as justified actions against paganism's supposed evils, but the violence they describe is undeniable. Perhaps most disturbing is evidence that Christian Vikings turned the same brutal tactics they had used as pagans against their own people. The same men who had raided Christian lands, who had killed Christian clergy and destroyed Christian sites, now employed identical methods against pagans. The skeletal remains of individuals executed for maintaining pagan practices show trauma patterns identical to those of Christian clergy, killed by pagan Vikings generations earlier. The conversion didn't change the fundamental violence of Norse culture, it merely redirected it. The conspiracy theory proved true, revealing that Christianity arrived in Scandinavia through processes that matched the brutality of the pagan era they supposedly ended. The transition from pagan to Christian Viking culture wasn't a moral transformation, but a change in religious allegiance that preserved the underlying capacity for systematic violence and persecution. It's hard not to wonder how different Norse Christianity became as a result of this violent conversion, whether the particular character of Scandinavian Christianity, with its emphasis on martyrdom and holy warfare, was shaped by the brutal methods through which it was established. The conspiracy theory that modern scholarship and popular culture have systematically whitewashed Viking history, deliberately minimizing evidence of their worst atrocities while emphasizing their achievements in exploration, craftsmanship and governance. That this sanitization serves contemporary political and cultural agendas rather than historical truth was dismissed by academics as conspiracy, thinking that misunderstood the complexities of historical interpretation. Scholars insisted they presented Vikings accurately, acknowledging their violence while also recognizing their cultural achievements. The theory that there was deliberate suppression or downplaying of evidence regarding slavery, genocide, child exploitation, and other atrocities seemed to accuse the entire field of academic malfeasance. Surely professional historians weren't deliberately hiding uncomfortable truths. Picture, if you will, the contrast between Viking exhibitions in major museums and the actual archaeological evidence those museums possess. Walk through the displays celebrating Viking craftsmanship, their ships, their jewellery, their art. Notice what's absent. The slave collars in museum storage, rarely displayed. The skeletal evidence of child sacrifice, mentioned in academic papers but not prominently featured in public exhibitions. The remains showing evidence of systematic torture, presented if at all with sanitized language about conflict or violence that obscures the specific brutality. The documentary evidence of atrocities, translated in scholarly journals but absent from popular histories. The curation choices aren't neutral, they shape public understanding in ways that minimize the darkest aspects of Viking culture. The conspiracy theory gains credibility when examining how Viking history is taught and presented. Educational materials emphasize exploration, technology, and cultural achievement. Children learn about Viking ships and myths, but rarely about the hundreds of thousands enslaved, the systematic violence, the industrial-scale human trafficking. Popular media presents Vikings as complex, anti-heroes, their violence contextualized and relativized, their victims largely invisible. The television shows, movies and novels that shape contemporary understanding of Vikings systematically omit or downplay the evidence this very script has documented. This isn't accidental, but reflects deliberate choices about which aspects of history to emphasise and which to minimise. But the hardship of this historical whitewashing extends beyond simple omission. There's evidence of active resistance within academic circles to researchers who emphasise Viking brutality. Scholars who focus on slavery, violence against children, or other uncomfortable topics report difficulty publishing in mainstream venues, face criticism for presentism or imposing modern moral judgments, and find their work dismissed as sensationalist despite being based on solid archaeological evidence. The field has professional incentives to present balanced, nuanced portraits of Viking culture that acknowledge both achievements and violence, but these incentives often result in false equivalence, treating systematic atrocities as somehow balanced by technological innovation or artistic achievement. The genetic evidence reveals one final uncomfortable truth: Viking violence had permanent demographic consequences that persist today. The genetic legacy of Viking raiding includes not just Scandinavian ancestry in regions they settled, but also evidence of systematic sexual violence. In regions of Ireland, Scotland and England with high levels of Scandinavian genetic markers, the patterns show disproportionate male-line Viking ancestry, combined with local female ancestry, exactly the signature of conquest involving the killing of local men and forced reproduction with local women. This wasn't cultural exchange, but genetic colonisation through violence. Modern populations carry in their DNA the evidence of atrocities their ancestors suffered, yet popular culture presents Vikings as fascinating historical figures, rather than perpetrators of multi-generational trauma. Perhaps most disturbing is recognising that the whitewashing isn't complete ignorance, but selective emphasis. The evidence documented throughout this script exists in archaeological reports, academic journals, and specialised publications. It isn't hidden. It's simply not prominently featured in popular histories, museum exhibitions, or media portrayals. The conspiracy theory proved true not because scholars are deliberately lying, but because the field, like society generally, prefers comfortable narratives to uncomfortable truths. We romanticise Vikings because acknowledging the full reality of their brutality, the scale of their atrocities, and the systematic nature of their violence would require confronting uncomfortable questions about human nature, about what societies are capable of, about how easily cultural achievements can coexist with monstrous behaviour. It's hard not to wonder what would happen if Viking history were presented with the same unflinching honesty we claim to demand from other historical studies, if museums displayed the slave collars as prominently as the jewellery, if popular media showed Viking reality rather than Viking fantasy, whether public fascination would survive contact with the truth that archaeology has been quietly documenting for decades. And so we reach the end of our journey through the conspiracy theories that turned out to be true, through the uncomfortable confirmations that archaeology has quietly provided while popular culture looked away. We've examined 25 aspects of Viking society, where the darkest theories, the accounts that seem too brutal to be believed, prove to be accurate or even understated when confronted with physical evidence. From human sacrifice to industrial-scale slavery, from child exploitation to environmental destruction, from biological warfare to systematic historical erasure, the pattern has been consistent. The truth was darker than comfortable scholarship wanted to acknowledge. Perhaps the most disturbing revelation isn't any single atrocity, but the systematic nature of Viking violence. The way brutality was woven into every aspect of their culture, from religion to economics, from family life to legal systems, from warfare to entertainment. This wasn't a society that occasionally committed atrocities in exceptional circumstances. This was a society built on exploitation, maintained through violence, and sustained by the systematic degradation of those it categorised as lesser. The conspiracy theorists who insisted Vikings were worse than sanitised histories suggested weren't engaging in prejudiced exaggeration. They were reading the evidence more accurately than the academics who dismissed them. The parallels to our own time are impossible to ignore. We live in an age that prefers comfortable narratives to uncomfortable truths, that celebrates cultural achievements while minimising atrocities, that finds ways to rationalise or contextualise behaviour that should horrify us. The whitewashing of Viking history isn't an isolated academic failure, but reflects broader human tendencies to look away from darkness, to emphasise the positive, to find reasons why those we admire couldn't have been as bad as the evidence suggests. Understanding Viking reality doesn't require us to hate or condemn them across the centuries. It requires us to see them clearly, to acknowledge what they were without romantic distortion. They were humans operating in harsh circumstances, making choices that prioritised their survival and prosperity at the expense of others, building impressive cultural achievements on foundations of systematic exploitation. They were capable of great craftsmanship and great cruelty, often simultaneously, often using the same cultural frameworks to justify both. The archaeological evidence doesn't lie, even when it tells us things we'd prefer not to hear. As you lie there in the darkness, perhaps you're thinking about what it means to confront historical truth, to look directly at human capacity for violence and exploitation without looking away. There's something valuable in that honesty, in refusing to romanticise or sanitise the past, simply because distance makes it easier to tolerate. The Vikings we've examined tonight weren't characters in a saga, or heroes in a television show. They were real people, who made real choices that caused real suffering to real victims whose bones still testify to what was done to them. Acknowledging this doesn't make us better than them, doesn't give us moral superiority across the centuries. It simply makes us honest. If this exploration has disturbed you, that's appropriate. The truth should disturb us sometimes. Comfort in the face of documented atrocity would itself be disturbing, a sign that we've become too accustomed to normalising violence through distance and academic language. The bones in those careful excavations, the DNA evidence revealing breeding programs and genetic colonisation, the skeletal trauma documenting systematic torture and exploitation, these aren't abstract data points, but evidence of individual human suffering multiplied across thousands or millions of lives. Every statistical pattern represents countless individuals who experience terror, pain, loss, and degradation. Every confirmed conspiracy theory represents validation for the victims whose accounts were dismissed for generations as exaggeration. I want to thank you for staying with me through this difficult journey, for being willing to confront uncomfortable truths, for resisting the easy comfort of romantic historical narratives. History isn't meant to make us feel good about humanity. It's meant to show us what we're capable of, both the heights of achievement and the depths of cruelty, so we can make informed choices about what we want to become. The Vikings show us humans at our most adaptive and most brutal, surviving impossible circumstances by becoming themselves impossible to survive. There's wisdom in that darkness if we're brave enough to extract it. Picture, if you will, one final image as sleep begins to claim you. The cold, northern soil of Scandinavia, layer upon layer of earth containing the evidence we've discussed tonight, bones and artifacts and chemical signatures waiting patiently for analysis that might never come. Beneath the ground lies truth, indifferent to our comfort or discomfort, unconcerned with our narratives or our need for heroes. The earth keeps its secrets until we're ready to excavate them, until we develop the courage and the technology to see what's really there. Some evidence remains buried still, waiting for future archaeologists with better tools and perhaps more honesty to uncover. Some truth was successfully erased by those who wanted to control their legacy, destroyed so thoroughly we'll never know what was lost. But what we have found, what we have examined, together tonight, is enough to understand the fundamental reality. Conspiracy theories about Viking brutality turned out to be true, not because historians were lying, but because humans prefer comfortable stories to uncomfortable truths, because we want our ancestors to be admirable, because acknowledging the full reality of historical violence requires confronting truths about human nature that disturb our sense of moral progress. As you drift towards sleep, let your mind release these dark images. Let the facts settle into memory without keeping you awake with horror. History is what it is, unchangeable, documented, waiting in the soil for anyone brave enough to look. We've looked together tonight, seen what we needed to see, and now we can let it rest. The Vikings were real, their victims were real, and the evidence is real. That's enough. Tomorrow you'll wake to a world where this knowledge exists but doesn't dominate, where you can carry awareness of historical truth without being paralysed by it. Sleep now, knowing that truth, however dark, is better than comfortable delusion. Rest in the knowledge that seeing clearly, even when what we see disturbs us, is an act of respect for those who suffered and were forgotten. Let the darkness of history fade into the darkness of sleep, and wake tomorrow to whatever light you can find. Thank you for listening. If you found value in this exploration, consider subscribing for more journeys into the uncomfortable corners of history. Until next time, dear listener, sleep well